Hey there, settle in. Tonight we're opening a drawer the Vatican kept nailed shut, not because of demons in red ink, but because of pale things that slipped past coffins and sacraments. This isn't a scream and jump tale. It's a slow pulse under marble floors, a question about why a church that stared down Satan still trembled at whispers of the undead. As always, only tap like or subscribe if these midnight walks through history genuinely soothe or fascinate you. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time glows on your clock right now? I love seeing that quiet constellation of insomniacs, night shifters, and dreamers. So dim the lights, let a fan or rain track hum in the background, and breathe easy. We'll move gently through beauty and rot, candles and coffins, because the past is never just holy or horrific. It's both. Ready? Let's lift the lid together. Thunder rolled over Rome in the spring of 1725, or so the monk who kept the abbey chronicles swore before his superior ordered the page scraped clean. Bells in the cloister tower began to toll without a rope man, slow and uneven, as if a tired arm pulled from the dark. In the crypt below, freshly plastered niches sweated and cracked, and one coffin lid shifted just enough to make a novice flee. The church had formulas for demons and a calendar for saints, but this was something uglier because it wore a face that should have been at peace. Reports like this did not fit neatly into canon law, yet they arrived from the borderlands of the Habsburg Empire in the very same decade. Places like Kisilova and Medvedja, where imperial surgeons opened corpses that looked pink and full of blood days after burial. Rome dismissed the word vampire as rustic folly. Yet, inquisitors quietly gathered testimonies, counting bite marks and midnight exhumations. The contradiction was unbearable. If Christ had conquered death, how could a peasant girl crawl from a grave and drink her kin? The answer, for now, was to smother the story. Monastery archivists relabeled files as fevers. Bishops urged swift reburial with lime and salt, and theologians sharpened quills to prove that souls could not linger in flesh. Still the bells rang in memory, and a rumor slid through sacristies that some evils did not need horns to terrify Rome. Long before the word vampire reached Italian ears, church fathers like Augustine and Jerome insisted that once a soul left the body, it faced judgment, not nocturnal errands. And yet medieval penitentials preserved odd questions for confessors about drinking blood or visiting graves at night. By the 17th century, scholars in Rome parsed scripture for loopholes, circling passages in Leviticus that forbade consuming blood, and those in Acts that warned against strangled meat, trying to decide if superstition masked a moral crime. Theologians leaned on Thomas Aquinas, who taught that demons could manipulate bodies and senses, but could not reanimate true corpses. And still, letters from Moravia and Styria described villagers who swore they had wrestled with cousins dead a fortnight. The contradiction forced a quiet distinction in curial corridors between what public doctrine affirmed and what private memoranda entertained. If resurrection belonged to God alone, any moving corpse must be trickery, illusion, or disease. Yet, imperial physicians like Johann Fluckinger in 1732 recorded autopsies of so-called vampires at Medvedja under oath, noting liquid blood, pliant limbs, and no sign of decay. Jesuit censors, reading his Latin account, hesitated to label it fraud outright, fearing the backlash if the Holy See seemed ignorant of frontier realities. Instead, they drafted advisory notes reminding bishops to condemn rumor while permitting sanitary exhumations when epidemic panic threatened order. Scripture remained unchanged, but marginal glosses multiplied, and some confessors were instructed to ask frightened penitents about dreams, diets, and resentments before speaking of the devil. In that hemmed space between Isaiah's promise that the dead shall rise and village tales of the dead who refused to stay down, Rome tried to keep its language airtight and its options open, praying that faith could outlast fear without admitting it trembled. Beneath Rome's marble floors runs a honeycomb of galleries first carved in the 2nd and 3rd centuries when Christians buried their dead in soft tufa, and those catacombs, sealed and sanctified, later fed stories that something down there still moved. Custodians in the 17th century logged occasional collapses and airflow shifts that made lamps gutter, yet superstitious guides whispered that footsteps sometimes echoed after the last pilgrim left. In 1578, when laborers opened a forgotten section along the Via Salaria and found thousands of skeletons later packaged as relics for export to Germany and Switzerland, the haste of exhumation let rumors bloom that certain bodies bled when touched. Antiquarians like Antonio Bosio, whose Roma Sotterranea appeared posthumously in 1632, carefully described inscriptions and martyr legends, but avoided the fresher tales that sacristans swapped after Compline. Moisture condensed on limestone, ran in thin crimson streaks where iron leached from ancient nails and anxious novices saw blood. Rats and foxes slipped through cracks and scratched at plaster, and one report from 1,693 notes a monk fainting at the sound, convinced a saint was clawing back to air. The truth was that burial practices changed after the Council of Trent, pushing noble bodies into church crypts rather than suburban catacombs. But that did not stop whispers that the old corridors breathed. When Pope Clement XI ordered better cataloging of martyrs' remains in the early 18th century, archivists recorded a different fear. If incorruptibility signaled holiness, what to make of a cadaver that stayed supple without fragrance of sanctity? Anatomists explained adipocere and cool, dry chambers, yet confessionals filled with penitents, terrified of relatives who had not stiffened. So candle by candle the church mapped subterranean Rome, blessing chambers and bricking dubious niches, insisting that the only things that rose there were prayers, while quietly noting every scratch, stain, and sigh that might one day demand a stake instead of a psalm. Medieval Europe knew the poison of blood libel well enough. The accusation that Jewish communities murdered Christians for ritual use, surfacing in Norwich in 1144, in Trent in 1475, and echoing through papal briefs that sometimes condemned the slander and sometimes fell silent. What frightened certain officials in Rome during the 17th and early 18th centuries was a quieter inversion of that myth, whispered in chancery corridors. What if the predator sat in a choir stall? In 1603, a visitation report from a Ligurian diocese recorded villagers claiming their bishop kept a locked room where sick parishioners left pale and weak. The nuncio dismissed it as factional politics, yet he ordered the files sealed. In 1659, a Carmelite prior in Naples wrote to the Holy Office about a confessor who licked blood from penitents as part of a bizarre penance, a charge later reduced to spiritual delusion to avoid scandal. Rome had rules for clerical concubinage, for simony, for priests who drank too much or struck wives they should never have had, but there was no canon for a curate rumored to drain a dying woman's wrist. When imperial officials in Vienna forwarded depositions from Moravian peasants in 1731 that named a parish deacon among the nocturnal feeders, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith urged local bishops to investigate with discretion and then to emphasize catechesis on the real presence, steering talk of blood toward theology and away from throats. The anxiety lay not only in the charge itself, but in its power to unravel sacramental trust. If a shepherd could become a leech, what did that say about the flock's safety or the efficacy of ordination? Consequently, some dioceses quietly instituted night watches over infirmaries. Others moved the dying from rectory rooms to public wards, always with pious language that masked fear. The Vatican would rather stamp out gossip than try a priest for vampirism, but every suppressed affidavit left a stain on parchment that no sand or pumice could erase. In January 1732, the Habsburg military administration in Belgrade forwarded to Vienna a Latin report titled Visum et Repertum, signed by the army surgeon Johann Flukinger and two colleagues who had ridden to the Serbian village of Medvedja after soldiers and peasants swore that the dead returned to suck blood. They opened 13 graves, noted bodies that were fresh, with liquid blood in the chest and mouth, nails and hair seeming longer, and they ordered stakes driven and heads severed before cremation. Copies of the dossier reached Roman diplomats through imperial channels by spring, bundled with earlier notices from Kiselova in 1725, where a man named Petar Blagojevich supposedly rose after 9 days to throttle neighbors. The Curia's first reaction was disdain, labeling the language rustic folly, yet the precision of the autopsy terms bothered Vatican readers trained in scholastic categories. The Congregation of the Holy Office weighed whether to answer officially, since admitting receipt conferred gravity on a superstition, but silence risked letting panic spread among Catholics under Habsburg rule. So a compromise formed. A private circular reminded bishops that natural causes of post-mortem bloating, purge fluid, and skin retraction could mimic vitality, and that only civil authorities should supervise disinterment to prevent sacrilege. At the same time, a second memorandum, marked for internal use, listed prophylactics the Church could tolerate under the veil of hygiene: quicklime in graves, deeper burial, prayers for the restless dead without naming them revenants. Jesuit correspondents in Vienna urged Rome to treat the affair as a tool of Protestant mockery, arguing that Lutherans would delight in Catholic credulity if Rome blinked. Yet parish clergy closer to the frontier begged for guidance beyond rhetoric, wanting to know whether to bless a stake or condemn it. Thus Hungary's letter became more than a frontier curiosity. It forced the Vatican to thread a needle between science, folklore, and authority, and the stitch they chose left a seam that would tug for decades. The Roman ritual, revised in 1614 under Paul V, laid out precise steps for expelling demons, commands in Latin, questions to verify possession, signs like aversion to holy things, or unknown tongues. And yet, none of those rubrics fit the farmer in Styria in 1718, who returned from burial with mud under his nails and an animal hunger in his eyes. The parish priest tried the formula anyway, adjuring the spirit by the Trinity, pressing a crucifix to lips that were still warm, only to watch the figure recoil not with the rage of a fallen angel, but with something closer to thirst. Reports from Poland and Croatia told similar stories. Exorcists recited litanies until their voices cracked, but the revenant did not convulse or blaspheme. It simply waited for darkness. Canonists argued that exorcism presumes a living host, or at least a demonic simulation of life. A corpse animated by unknown forces sat outside jurisdiction, which left clergy improvising. Some sprinkled holy water, and then drove an ash stake through the sternum, blessing neither action in public. Others read the office of the dead over an already buried body, hoping liturgy might anchor a soul if it still drifted. A Franciscan in Ragusa wrote that the only thing that quieted one suspected vampire was the Eucharist placed secretly in the grave, a remedy his guardian forbade on pain of suspension for sacrilege. Medical men who observed these failures suggested putrefaction gases and village hysteria, but that did not answer the priest alone at midnight with a family begging him to stop a corpse from visiting. Manuals began to include discreet addenda. If ordinary exorcism shows no effect and scandal threatens, advise civil authorities to proceed with anatomical inspection while the priest prays nearby, thus preserving both faith and pulse. In practice, this meant the Church admitted defeat without saying so, letting stakes do what Scripture could not, and then filing the whole night under the word epidemic. Incorruptibility had long served Rome as a quiet proof that grace could touch flesh. From the sweet, scented body of Saint Catherine of Bologna in 1463 to the unblackened skin of Saint Francis Xavier when exhumed in 1554, but the category turned treacherous when not one but several provincial corpses showed the same freshness without a whiff of sanctity. Parish reports from the Veneto in 1709, and from Krakow's outskirts in 1713 spoke of bodies exhumed weeks after burial that bled when pricked, and whose lips seemed fuller than on the day of death. Miracles required investigation, affidavits, and often years of scrutiny before Rome dared endorse them, yet panic demanded replies overnight. Physicians cited adiposity, the waxy transformation of fat in cool, damp soil first described by anatomists in the 17th century, and they noted that hair and nails only seemed to grow as skin shrank. Still, villagers saw soft cheeks and red mouths and thought of thirst. Relic guardians grew nervous. If holiness kept some bodies intact, what kept these others supple? A Capuchin friar in Padua argued that the devil could mimic divine signs to ensnare the simple, but his provincial begged him to keep that thought private, lest pilgrims stop coming. The Congregation of Rites quietly tightened its standards for declaring incorruption, insisting on odor, pliability, and freedom from blood seepage. Criteria designed as much to exclude vampires as to confirm saints. In one Benedictine abbey near Salzburg, the abbot ordered nocturnal vigils in the crypt, not for devotion but to ensure nothing stirred. Candles were trimmed low so any movement would throw a shadow, and brothers assigned to watch pretended they were doing penance. When nothing happened, they thanked God. When something did, they reported drafts and rodents, never fangs. Thus the Church maintained a fragile distinction. Miracles edified, anomalies explained themselves, and any corpse that refused both categories was hurried back under earth with lime, prayers, and silence. Benedictine customs prized communal burial. Brothers laid side by side beneath the abbey floor as a sign that even in death the choir remained united. But that very closeness became a terror when one grave was said to disturb the rest. In 1710, at an abbey near Passau, a lay brother sworn to silence later confessed to a diocesan visitor that he and 2 others heard muffled knocks from the crypt after Compline, 3 slow taps that matched the rhythm of the bells for the dead. The prior ordered the passage barred, and incense burned until morning. Yet the rumor escaped the cloister wall, and by week's end villagers whispered that Brother Conrad had risen hungry. Canon law offered nothing on how to separate a possibly tainted corpse from 40 others without desecrating the whole common grave. The solution was a midnight excavation under the guise of repairing a stone arch. Monks with shovels and one nervous surgeon from the nearby town opened the trench and sprinkled quicklime while chanting the office of the dead so any watcher would believe it pious maintenance. When Conrad's body appeared still pliant after 8 days, the surgeon called it cold weather preservation, but one monk swore the lips were wet. The abbot faced an impossible choice. Admit fear and sanction a stake, inviting scandal, or double the prayers and hope silence smothered panic. He chose a compromise. Conrad was reburied deeper with a rosary of iron beads tucked in his hands, a folk remedy disguised as devotion, and the community received a stern chapter talk on gossip. A report to Rome spoke only of structural repairs. Yet, in the margins, a note in small script read, "Watch again in a fortnight." Thus, the Benedictine ideal of shared rest bent under anxiety, and lime-joined psalms as tools of order. A linen corporal stained with unexpected blood was not unheard of in church memory. The miracle of Bolsena in 1263 told of a doubting priest whose host dripped crimson onto the altar cloth, later enshrined at Orvieto, and such tales fortified doctrine on the real presence. Yet, when crimson drops spattered a corporal in a parish near Parma in 1707, and the priest swore they fell from the rafters rather than the chalice, panic edged past piety. The ceiling was searched for burst pipes, though there was no plumbing, for wounded pigeons, though none nested there, for pranksters with vials of animal blood. What the sexton found instead were faint scratches on a beam above the altar, and a smear that seemed to pulse when lantern light wavered. He said nothing until night, when he and 2 altar boys claimed to hear something shuffle overhead during benediction. The bishop arrived quietly with a mason who opened the cavity. They found only damp wood and a bat colony startled into flight. Yet the corporal still bore its stains, and townsfolk whispered that something had fed and dripped back what it could not stomach. Rome demanded the cloth be sent for examination. Canonists reminded the bishop that Eucharistic miracles required sworn testimony and a chain of custody, but he preferred to bury the incident beneath incense and new plaster. He ordered the rafters sealed with iron nails, a superstition disguised as structural repair, and had the corporal washed in wine and water so no relic hunter could claim it. In catechism, the priests spoke of Bolsena and Lanciano to teach belief. In sacristy corners they muttered about bats that sucked and creatures that hid above the altar. The Mass continued, but every creak in the roof turned heads, and for months the people watched the ceiling more than the chalice. While the bishop prayed, the only blood his diocese would discuss stayed safely on linen in a monstrance. Somewhere between the Jesuit Curia on the Via degli Ostali and a provincial house in Vienna, a thin vellum booklet vanished, a manual that several later catalogues list only as De Nocturnis Predatoribus et Tutela Parochiae, with a note that it was for internal circulation among mission superiors. Jesuit historians today deny such a title, yet marginal references in an 1734 letter from Father Franz Retz, then Superior General, warn Austrian fathers to avoid crude remedies against so-called vampires while maintaining vigilance over graves during epidemics. The rumor in Roman coffeehouses, frequented by clerics, was that the Society of Jesus had compiled case summaries from Moravia, Silesia, and Croatia, systematizing what parish priests were already doing in secret. Lime, deeper trenches, prayers for souls thought trapped, never the word stake. Scribes in the College Romano library later penciled a gap in the shelf list where a codex should have stood, and a docket in the Archivum Romanum Societatis Isu records a request to destroy compromising folklore materials during the suppression debates of the 1750s. One archivist, Luigi Ricci, left a teasing flourish on a folder edge, 2 tiny triangles like fangs, before the glue pulled the page to the pasteboard forever. Scholars who combed the Vatican archives after Leo XIII opened them in 1881 found no trace, but they did find an instruction from 1738 reminding confessors to discourage belief in the walking dead while allowing civil authorities to proceed with sanitary measures. That sentence smells of Jesuit drafting, careful, layered, designed to calm and to control. Whether a field manual truly existed or was only whispered into being by frightened missionaries matters less than what the story reveals. The most learned order in the Church, trained in casuistry and science, felt compelled to write policies for creatures officially denied. A book that cannot be found still casts a shadow if enough men remember turning its pages. The Roman and Spanish Inquisitions catalogued offenses with bureaucratic zeal-heresy, sorcery, quietism, solicitation in confession, each with precedents, procedures, and penances, yet nowhere in the directories of Nicolau Eymerich or the instructions of Cardinal Valdez was there a rubric for a corpse that would not stay put. When reports from Friuli in 1645 and later from Carniola in the 1720s described villagers staking bodies under moonlight, local inquisitors hesitated. To prosecute the dead for witchcraft made no sense, but to ignore the living who mutilated cadavers risked scandal and charges of paganism. Some tribunals tried an end run. They reframed vampirism as superstition, punishable because it doubted divine providence and the sufficiency of Christian burial. Thus, defendants were not the alleged revenants, but their persecutors, men who opened graves without episcopal license. Still, transcripts reveal moments when inquisitors asked witnesses to describe the color of the exhumed flesh, the presence of blood at the mouth, the swelling of the abdomen, questions that sound more like a physician's checklist than a theologian's probe. In Venice, whose Holy Office operated semi-independently, a 1,731 file notes that commissioners ordered reinterment with lime to quiet the people, even as they fined those who spread tales of sucking spirits. The Congregation of the Holy Office in Rome sent circulars urging uniformity, condemn the belief, tolerate the hygienic practice if civil health required it, never let the word vampirus enter a decree. Behind that uniform voice, debate simmered. Could the devil counterfeit life in a corpse? Aquinas allowed demons to move bodies, but not to raise souls, a distinction that satisfied scholastics and baffled peasants who only saw their aunt at the window after burial. The Inquisition, designed to police thought, found itself policing graves instead. So it stretched categories, calling a midnight exhumation an occasion of superstition, and sentencing offenders to pilgrimages or alms. The walking dead never stood before a tribunal, but their shadows did, reflected in parchment where ink tried to pin fear long enough to pronounce it error. In 1724, a diocesan courier from Ragusa carried to Rome a packet of drawings that should never have existed, ink studies of a rib cage split like a book, and a heart pierced and removed, each sheet initialed by Father Andrija Vukovic, a parish priest with medical training from Padua who had been summoned to a Dalmatian village where the dead were said to prowl. The local magistrate begged for science to calm the panic, so Vukovic opened the grave of a man dead 12 days, recording that the lungs were moist, the stomach bloated with what he believed was congealed blood, the mouth smeared crimson as if recently fed. He labeled each organ in Latin, careful and cold, then added a note in the margin confessing that the widow swore she felt his breath the night before. When the dossier reached the congregation of the Holy Office, consultors debated whether a priest had violated canon law by performing surgery on a corpse without ecclesiastical permission. One argued that charity toward the living justified the cut. Another warned that meddling in graves emboldened superstition. To bury the issue, literally and figuratively, officials filed the sketches under a botany reference code, the Scudarium Florarum, so any future reader would assume plant studies. Vukovic received a private admonition to confine his zeal to souls, yet the bishop quietly kept him on call for future outbreaks. In his journal, later found in a convent attic, Vukovic wrote that prayer steadied his hand, but the knife steadied the village, an admission that Rome could not accept in print. The case proved a template. Let the man in a collar wield the scalpel if fear threatened order, then rename his work until the ink itself forgot. Bodies opened, files closed, and the church moved on, outwardly untouched, inwardly aware that one priest with a blade could quiet a rumor faster than a choir of theologians. Confessionals in country parishes were never built for the kind of secrets that began to seep through their lattices when famine and fever loosened tongues. A miller's daughter in Slovakia told her priest she woke with a taste of iron and straw in her mouth and a craving that made her ashamed to kneel. A cowherd in Istria whispered that he drank from a calf's slit throat at dusk and felt stronger by dawn. Priests were trained to hear sins of flesh and pride, to untangle contracts and blasphemies. They were not prepared for penitents who begged for absolution because they feared what they might become after burial. Manuals like the Roman Catechism offered no question that began with, "Have you visited a grave to drink?" So confessors improvised, asking about envy and gluttony, about dreams that left bite marks on waking flesh, trying to fold the strange into familiar vices. Some grew harsh, assigning bread and water fasts to those who tasted blood, hoping hunger would make the desire fade. Others panicked and reported to bishops who ordered silence, for fear that naming the temptation would spread it. One Jesuit in Croatia kept a notebook of phrases overheard through the grill, writing only initials to shield identities. He noted that several penitents described the host burning their tongue, a detail that alarmed him more than tales of midnight wandering. If the Eucharist wounded them, what did that imply? Physicians might diagnose pica or anemia, but a priest at midnight with a trembling farmer could not prescribe iron. He could only bind the sinner to prayer and threaten excommunication if graves were disturbed. Over time, some dioceses issued private directives urging confessors to steer talk towards spiritual thirst, to replace the image of veins with that of Christ's side pierced on Calvary. It worked often enough to quiet the parish, yet the grill remembered, wood polished by hands that gripped it in fear, and the men inside those boxes aged faster than their mitred superiors who never had to hear a whisper that tasted of blood. Somewhere in the maze of the apostolic palace clerks prepared a papal brief that would never see a press, a document drafted in cautious Latin to instruct bishops on disturbances of the grave without uttering the forbidden word everyone was whispering. The year is usually given as 1738 by later archivists who cite a docket number now missing, but internal clues point to Clement XII's pontificate when Habsburg envoys were flooding Rome with frontier reports. The text, according to a notary who referenced it in his own diary, affirmed the sufficiency of Christian burial, forbade laity to open tombs, permitted exhumation only under episcopal and civil authority in cases of contagion, and warned clergy not to credit tales of sanguis hostis, the drinking of blood, as anything but illusion or disease. A final clause, the most daring outlined prayers ad pacem defunctorum, for the peace of the restless dead, to be said quietly if panic threatened the faithful. That sentence alone doomed the brief. To acknowledge unrest was to crack doctrine. When the draft reached the congregation of the Holy Office, cardinals split. Some urged promulgation to impose order. Others feared that printing the policy would grant reality to the rumor. The Pope, half blind and beset by finances for his grandiose Fontana di Trevi project, deferred. The document was sealed, then misfiled, perhaps deliberately, in a box marked for indulgence regulations. Years later, a junior archivist found only wax residue and impressions of a lost seal on the ribbon. The bull that never was became another ghost in Rome's paperwork, proof that even in the heart of certainty men hesitated. Bishops instead received private letters, each tailored to local needs, and the universal voice of Peter stayed silent on the matter of teeth after death. Silence, however, speaks loudly when fear thrives. Parish priests sense that if Rome could not name the terror, they themselves must face it, stake or psalm in hand, with only rumor to guide them. In village tool chests across the Balkans and along the Alps, iron nails, garlic braids, and ash stakes sat beside rosaries and holy cards, a mingling of folk cure and sacrament that embarrassed bishops but steadied peasants. Parish priests learned to speak two languages at once. By daylight, they preached that holy water, and the sign of the cross defeated any darkness. After sunset, they sanctioned quicklime, deeper graves, and sometimes the quiet driving of a stake with a whispered prayer, never written in the parish register. Manuals of moral theology did not list salt circles or poppy seeds, scattered on thresholds to delay a revenant. Yet more than one curate kept such seeds in his pocket as he walked the churchyard. The compromise took form in practice, if not in print. Bless the grave again, sprinkle it generously, then let the men with shovels do what fear demanded while the priest turned away just long enough to claim ignorance. In Krakow, a canon lawyer drafted an opinion stating that an action intended for public health could be tolerated if the actor rejected superstition interiorly, a casuist knot that allowed a blessing over a stake without calling it that. Jesuits argued for education, Capuchins for fasting, villagers for axes. The Church, determined to preserve unity, folded all of it into a pastoral fog where no one quite admitted what was done. Eventually, some dioceses issued sealed instructions. If bodies are exhumed, ensure decency. If limbs are severed, burn them discreetly. If people demand proof, offer masses for the dead and urge confession. Each remedy, sacred or sharp, aimed at the same goal end, the fear before it unraveled faith. Over time, the memory of such nights faded into alleys of gossip, but the stakes left stains on shovels stored behind sacristy doors, and the salt caked under nails of men who swore they were only gardeners. The abbey on the Po Plain had weathered wars, floods, and reforms, but nothing unsettled its rhythm like the rumor that something was walking in the cloister after midnight and pausing beneath the infirmary windows. The prior noticed first that brothers on night prayer began to huddle closer to the candles, that the infirmarian refused to sleep alone near the mortuary room, that the porter locked the gate twice and then wedged a bench against it. Officially, the house observed the rule: silence after Compline, charity toward the sick, steady work in the fields. Unofficially, a plan formed that broke every architectural harmony the monks loved: brick the lower windows, seal the crypt stair, limit entry to the church by one door so the watcher at the font could see who passed. They called it strengthening against damp and thieves when they wrote Rome for permission to spend from the endowment. The mason hired from the nearby town asked why the walls needed iron clamps set into mortar, and the cellarer answered with a shrug that wine thieves were bold this year. Inside the chapter room, the debate was roar. One elder insisted that fear itself was the enemy, and that prayer would outlast any prowler. Another argued that prudence was not cowardice, and pointed to St. Benedict's own counsel to guard the community. They compromised by keeping vigil in pairs, never alone, and by placing a crucifix carved with unusually long nails above the crypt door. Iron meant as much for legend as for devotion. When nothing appeared for weeks, courage returned, yet the bricks stayed. In letters to the bishop, the prior reported only improvements to drainage. In his private journal, he admitted he heard footsteps that stopped when he breathed too loudly. The abbey returned to its psalms, but its architecture now remembered a night of dread. Each blocked arch, a mute confession that even cloistered hearts sometimes choose walls over wonder. Northern Italian archives groan with parchments tracing noble lineages back through crusades and Roman senators. Yet, a cluster of families in Friuli and Lombardy carried a quieter rumor inside their heraldic pride: that an ancestor simply never died. A notary in Udine around the 1680s noted with irritation that Count Alvise della Torre appeared in tax rolls 80 years apart with the same firm hand. In Bergamo, a parish register records a Marchese who requested no candles at his vigil and whose coffin was sealed with chains rather than wax. Gossip said these houses kept shutters closed at noon, that their chapels smelled of iron and myrrh, that portraits were retouched so the eyes never faded. Rome faced a dilemma when whispers named titled patrons as undead. To accuse was to risk scandal and legal retaliation. To ignore was to let the tale grow. The Congregation for Bishops advised careful visitation under pretext of confirming marriages or estates, while discreetly interviewing servants about night habits and pantry stores. One Jesuit genealogist wrote that a certain line showed impossible overlaps of baptismal and death dates, then crossed out the remark and replaced it with a note about clerical error. In one case, a bishop ordered the exhumation of a countess whose skin was said to shine in lamplight. The tomb yielded only dust and jewels, and the bishop preached on vanity the following Sunday as if to erase the incident. Yet the servants kept putting garlic in window boxes and sprinkling millet on thresholds to count the steps of anything that entered. Noble chapels quietly installed iron grills over family vault vents, a security measure for thieves, they said. The Vatican pretended not to see, but privately it logged the reports as symptoms of anxiety in regions already torn by war and plague. Bloodlines were not immortal. Power sometimes only looked that way when records were sloppy and portraits retouched. Still, the idea that aristocracy could evade death tasted too close to theology to ignore. Take a breath. We have only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what is hidden. Mirrors in sacristies were meant for checking vestments and soot on foreheads after Ash Wednesday, not for testing whether a curate cast a reflection. Yet, by the mid-18th century, some rectories quietly kept a polished glass beside the cruets. Folklore from the Balkans said the undead could not be seen in mirrors, a belief Rome dismissed as vanity. But a few nervous bishops let the superstition ride under another name, prudence. Candidates for ordination in one Tuscan diocese were asked, half joking, to stand before the sacristy mirror at dawn, when light is soft and eyes are honest. They laughed, passed, and forgot. Others did not. A priest in Carniola wrote that a visiting friar seemed to blur at the edge of the glass, a trick perhaps of candle smoke, yet the image lodged and festered. Theological treatises loathed the notion because it implied a physical law beyond grace. Aquinas allowed that demons could manipulate perception, but not metaphysics. If a mirror failed, the fault lay in the eye, or the silvering, never in the soul. Still, parish gossip cared little for summa distinctions. Mothers told children to check their own reflections after funerals, to be sure nothing followed them home. The church responded by baptizing the custom. Confessors advised penitents, plagued by visions, to gaze at a crucifix rather than a mirror, to anchor sight in symbol, not superstition. In a Roman seminary lecture of 1741, a professor mocked Slavic tales of mirrorless monsters, then admitted privately to a friend that he avoided the long gallery of portraits at night because he disliked being watched by faces that never blinked. Mirrors multiplied in churches during the Baroque to reflect candlelight and gilding, to make glory shimmer. They also multiplied doubts. If a chalice could hold God, could a mirror hold absence? Clergy kept their answers neat in sermons and messy in practice, sliding between ridicule and ritual as easily as light between glass and eye. Funerals for cardinals followed choreography older than many kingdoms, candles and silver stands, Swiss guards at attention, a coffin of cypress within a second of lead, then burial in a chapel niche until marble could be carved. When Cardinal Girolamo Casanate died in 1700, the rites flowed without a hitch, but another case decades later unsettled the script. Witnesses at a Roman vigil swore the corpse's skin deepened from waxen white to a flushed rose on the third night, that beads of moisture gathered at the lips, that a faint metallic scent, not incense, crept through Santa Maria sopra Minerva. Protocol required 3 days of public viewing for high prelates. By dawn of day 4, the master of ceremonies shortened the hours, citing heat even though the nave was cold. Whispered consultations followed. Should they bleed the body to prove it still? A surgeon from Santo Spirito Hospital suggested the discoloration came from internal purge fluids common in sealed coffins. The sacristan who sponged the mouth claimed the cloth came away redder than wine. Rome could not allow a spectacle. The coffin was closed earlier than planned, the procession sped up, and burial occurred at first light with fewer witnesses. Behind the altar, a mason later noted soot on the wall where none should be, as if something hot had pressed there. The Congregation of Rites kept no public record, but a private memo urged limiting nocturnal vigils in warm seasons and encouraging prompt entombment. Theologians reassured themselves that incorruption accompanied sweet fragrance, not copper tang, and that any bleed was natural. Yet gossip wandered faster than doctrine. Within weeks, pilgrims asked which chapel held the cardinal who blushed in death. Guides shrugged, sold medals, and moved them along. In the archive, a clerk penciled beside the burial entry, mutatio coloris observata, color change observed, then blotted it before the ink dried, choosing discretion over curiosity in a city already heavy with miracles and too few explanations. Archivists were supposed to be invisible hands, copying decrees, indexing briefs, binding registers in calfskin so smooth it felt like prayer. Yet one junior scribe in the Vatican secret archives during the 1740s left a trail that still startles anyone who turns those leaves. In the margin of a council act concerning burial regulations, he inked 2 discrete triangles beside a phrase about nocturnal disturbances, teeth so tiny a hurried reader would miss them. On another folio, where a bishop asked for permission to exhume a noblewoman whose corpse was said to bleed, the same hand shaded a drop of red that is not red at all, but a denser patch of black. A joke only the bored or the frightened make. The man signed nothing. Pale watermarks suggest his quill moved fast in winter when ink dries slower. A colleague later identified him as Lorenzo B., a lay clerk from Viterbo who liked to sketch cherubs in his ledger margins. Cherubs do not have fangs. Why did he draw them? Perhaps he had read the suppressed Visum et Repertum and could not resist needling the solemn Latin. Perhaps he had seen something in a Roman crypt after hours and needed proof that he had not imagined it. Marginalia in sacred bureaucracy are acts of rebellion, tiny punctures in the veil of certainty. When a superior noticed the doodles, he ordered the leaves scraped, but the pumice left scars and ghosts of lines. Subsequent binders tipped in fresh paper, yet collectors later lifting corners found the shadows. Scholars argue that these marks reveal nothing about policy and everything about atmosphere. Fear makes jokes sharp. Secrecy makes ink mischievous. The archive, intended as a fortress of memory, became a confessional for a pen that could not speak aloud. Lorenzo died in obscurity, listed in the payroll one year and not the next. His teeth remain. They grin at any reader willing to tilt the page toward the light, a reminder that even inside the most controlled institution, someone felt the need to bite back with a whisper of ink. Scholastic theology loved clean borders. Soul separates from body at death. Particular judgment follows. Body waits for resurrection at the end of time. Then came the cases that refused to sit quietly in tombs, and a handful of canonists in Rome began to ask a question they hoped no one would read aloud. If a corpse moves, what inhabits it? Thomas Aquinas had argued that demons can push matter, fashion illusions, even seize a cadaver briefly, but they cannot reunite a rational soul with decayed flesh. That doctrine soothed professors, not parishioners, who swore they heard a dead uncle call their name. A Dominican lecturer at Santa Maria sopra Minerva in 1733 drafted a disputation de corpore ambitioso on the ambitious body, where he proposed 3 possibilities: demonic puppetry, natural misperception, or a soul denied rest through sin not confessed. The last option he crossed out before circulating his text because it implied purgatory could spill over into night roads. Jesuit moralists preferred to fold the problem into deception. If Satan animates a shell, charity demands we treat the living with comfort and the shell with reverent disposal, never ritual designed for animals. Yet, reports from the Balkans kept noting recognizable speech and memories, things no demon should counterfeit without God's permission. A canon lawyer suggested a subtler path. Perhaps what people met was not the true person, but a residue, a kind of echo in flesh, preserved by unusual soil and stoked by fear. That explanation pleased no one and satisfied everyone enough to move on. Meanwhile, parish clergy kept facing eyes that looked like someone they had buried last week. They responded with prayers for the dead said at the grave itself, a practice Rome normally discouraged outside funerals, hoping to calm any restless remnant without naming it. The Congregation of the Holy Office issued a quiet reminder that the soul's journey is fixed by God, not folklore. Between the lines, it admitted nothing and allowed everything. Theology of the undead became a shadow discipline, argued in margins, whispered in sacristies, never preached from pulpits, the kind of thought that leaves no thesis but lingers as a sigh when a coffin creaks. Rumor slid through parish kitchens that the consecrated host burned the tongues of those who had drunk blood, a test as perilous as it was blasphemous if handled like a parlor trick. In a monastery near Varaždin, a frightened widow confessed that when she received communion her mouth seared, and she spat the fragment into her kerchief, then lied to the priest, trembling that she had profaned the sacrament. Word reached the bishop, who questioned her gently and sent for a physician who found ulcers and called it fever. Yet the story spread faster than the cure. Priests began to watch communicants for flinches, a twitch at the moment of contact, an involuntary hiss when wafer met tongue. Jesuit spiritual directors warned against turning the altar rail into an inquest. Grace is not litmus, they wrote, and the Eucharist is not a brand for sinners. Still, a clandestine circle of curates in Slavonia admitted in letters that they had withheld communion from those suspected of nocturnal hunger until they could be examined in confession. That practice risked schism more than superstition. Canon law forbade denying the sacrament without manifest grave sin. To claim vampirism counted as manifest was to drag folklore into jurisprudence. So Rome intervened, quietly. A memorandum from the Congregation of the Council in 1735 advised pastors that any physiological reaction to the host should be treated as illness unless the communicant publicly mocked the rite. The same sheet reminded them to instruct the faithful that unworthy reception harms the soul, not the tongue. Meanwhile, in one Croatian parish, a curate tried an experiment he never recorded officially. He touched unconsecrated bread to the lips of a suspected revenant, and saw no wince, then gave the consecrated host, and saw the man flail. Was it guilt, coincidence, or diabolical mimicry? He never decided. He only wrote that his hand shook for weeks. In the end, the Church chose the safer scandal, to be thought naive rather than cruel. Better to let a monster swallow Christ than to deny Christ to a frightened man. When a pope orders a grave opened, protocol multiplies like candles at Easter. The case most whispered about in Curial corridors involved a prelate buried in a side chapel of Santa Maria in Trastevere whose relatives swore his coffin thumped at night. The parish priest begged the vicariate for guidance. The vicariate stalled, and finally a discreet rescript bearing the fisherman's ring authorized an inspection sine scandalo, without scandal. At midnight a small party gathered. 2 canons, a surgeon from Santo Spirito, a notary, and a Swiss guard whose pike felt ridiculous among shovels. The marble slab was lifted, the lead casket pried, and a smell, neither sweet nor fetid, rose, metallic and damp. The face looked less collapsed than expected. Lips seemed moist, beard bristles rough against gloved fingers. The surgeon pricked the chest and noted a thin ooze. He declared it post-mortem transudation, a common seep, then recommended limestone to dry the cavity. The canons recited the office of the dead, while the notary kept his quill steady, recording nothing of moisture or movement, only that the body was found compositus et quietus, composed and quiet. After resealing, the Pope's chamberlain collected the record and instructed the notary to file it under structural repairs. What mattered to Rome was control. The act proved that authority reached even into the tomb, yet the language erased any hint of fear. Word still leaked. A sacristan told a cousin, who told a tavern, who told a pamphleteer. Soon handbills asked why Peter's heirs feared their own. The Holy Office traced the gossip and fined the printer for sedition, never mentioning blood. The Pope said nothing publicly, preached charity at the next consistory, and commissioned a painting of St. Michael defeating the dragon. Those who were there remembered only the sound of lead bending and a single drop that fell on the notary's shoe, dark in candlelight and gone by morning. Whispers in the Schola Cantorum of a Roman basilica began when two trebles arrived at rehearsal with bruises high on their necks, round and dark, like the bite of an animal that should not have been in a dormitory. The choirmaster blamed rough play. The prefect of discipline blamed damp linens. But the boys would not sleep alone and swore they felt breath at the window before matins. Choir schools kept their own rules, half monastic and half military, yet none covered nocturnal visitors that left no footprints. A canon assigned to oversee the youths ordered candles left burning in the corridor and placed a reliquary at the threshold, a saint's finger behind glass, meant to anchor courage. When another boy fainted during the gradual and woke, murmuring that Brother Paolo's eyes were at the window, though Paolo had died in Lent, the rector sent a sealed note to the vicar of Rome pleading for counsel. The reply advised medical inspection for anemia and stricter curfew. Meanwhile, the dormitory windows were barred and curtains stitched so tight no draught could flutter them. A lay porter began to patrol with a lantern and a staff tipped with iron nails, a tool he called a wolf stick when asked. The language around the choir shifted. Masters spoke of spiritual warfare, of temptations that attacked the throat, of the need to confess any strange dreams immediately. The boys learned to sing louder to drown the creaks in the rafters. One evening, the sacristan found a smear of blood on the west gallery rail, where no candle had dripped. He wiped it with wine and said nothing. Records from the basilica show only a note that the choir was moved to a lower room for acoustic improvement. No one wrote of the pairings at night, the way each child now slept with another hand in reach, or the whispered recitation of the Angelus at odd hours. Rome could not afford scandal in a choir that sang for cardinals. So the music went on, pure and bright, while fear hummed an undertone only the boys could hear. Missionaries sent east by the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith were trained to chart souls, not corpses, yet letters from Jesuits in Serbia and Franciscans in Wallachia during the 1720s and 1730s read like siege reports. Father Augustine Calmet in Lorraine would later collect such accounts, but Rome saw them first in raw form. Villagers digging up cadavers 6 weeks dead, soldiers standing guard while hearts were burned, mothers insisting their infants wasted because a dead neighbor came nightly to press on their chests. One friar described a procession at dusk, where women carried bowls of garlic and men hefted mallets, all under a crucifix held high as if to sanctify the stake. The missionaries begged for directives. Should they denounce every exhumation as sacrilege, or admit that panic over plague needed venting? A propagandified consultor drafted a reply, urging catechesis on final judgment and forbidding clergy to strike bodies, yet he allowed medical men to supervise burials in epidemic zones. That phrase became a loophole wide enough for any village surgeon with a cassocked friend to drive wood through a sternum while a priest muttered the De Profundis. Reports show weary irony. One Jesuit joked that he heard more confessions with shovels leaning on the confessional than with rosaries in hands. Another wrote that he taught peasants to place blessed candles at windows rather than sharpened stakes, only to find both candles and stakes set out that night. The exchange of letters grew testy. Vienna pressed Rome to quell hysteria. Rome pressed missionaries to hold the line of doctrine. Missionaries pressed no one because they were too busy keeping peace. By the time copies reached Calmet's desk in France, the edges were smudged and the Latin tired. He published cautiously. Rome grimaced, and peasants kept digging. Seminarians in a Jesuit college near Ljubljana were told their anatomy lesson would concern the heart as metaphor, Augustine, not Galen. Yet the prefect of studies unlocked the crypt door after Compline and led 6 of them down with lanterns that smoked and stung. On a table lay a body exhumed that afternoon from a parish 2 valleys away, a man dead 11 days during a fever that took half the hamlet. The civil surgeon had begged for clerical presence, so the people would not cry sorcery. The lungs gleamed wet, the abdomen ballooned, the mouth ringed in a dark crust that smelled of iron. The seminarian who would later preach gentleness could not stop staring at the tongue, thick and loose, as if it had just lapped. Latin terms steadied trembling voices. They spoke of putrefactio, of gases, of cadaveric lividity, and pretended the widow's testimony about nightly visits was only grief. One novice whispered that a stake would end this faster. The rector hissed that discipline ends panic, not wood. Still, he allowed quicklime to be poured and the ribs to be wired shut, a precaution he called structural. Back upstairs, the students washed in perfumed water and read Compline as if the Psalms could scrub smell from memory. Rome never heard the full scene. The report sent to Propaganda Fide mentioned only sanitary inspection and pastoral care. Yet in lecture notes from that year, someone penciled a question beside Aquinas on the separation of soul and body. What moves a tongue that has no soul? The ink was blotted, but not erased. The episode changed pedagogy. Future classes covered miasma theory and how to calm a crowd at a graveside. Theology did not shrink. It simply acquired an odor. The seminarians learned that courage sometimes wears an apron, and that prayer can sound like the clink of a scalpel in a basin. Pilgrimage shrines lived on stories of healing, candles guttering before reliquaries, crutches left behind as proof that grace had muscle. But a Marian chapel outside Czestochowa faced a different kind of testimony. When villagers swore a buried benefactor walked at dusk and chilled the hands of those who touched the gate. Guardians of the shrine counted coins and candles, not footsteps, yet they noticed offerings shift from wax limbs to sachets of salt and iron nails tied with ribbon. The prior feared that if word spread that revenants prowled near the Black Madonna, fewer pilgrims would come. So he doubled processions and announced novenas for the souls in purgatory, hoping to redirect fear into doctrine. At night, he stationed lay brothers around the cemetery wall, each with a lantern and a psalter, and told them to watch for thieves. They watched for movement in the earth instead. When a grave was found sunken and the soil damp, the local magistrate wanted it opened. The prior hesitated until a delegation of women, candles dripping on their fingers, demanded peace for their children, who woke gasping. The exhumation took place before dawn. The body looked swollen, the mouth smeared, the beard grown ragged. A physician said gases. A blacksmith muttered steak. The prior compromised with lime and prayers, covering the act with litanies so anyone listening would hear only Latin, not the scrape of bone. Rome heard about the incident through a routine financial report that mentioned extraordinary expenses for cemetery repairs. A consultor in the Congregation of Rites scribbled a note to remind rectors that relics must be kept free of superstition, then filed it. Meanwhile, pilgrims kept arriving, kissing glass, leaving rosaries, and slipping small packets of garlic at the chapel door when no one looked. The shrine endured, radiant by day, and the cemetery settled under winter snow, but the memory of that damp grave threaded itself into the legend. A shadow at the edge of a miracle, where faith and fear touched hands in the dark. Miracles drew pilgrims, anomalies drew auditors. When a monastery near Linz reported a relic that bled each year on the feast of its martyr, Rome dispatched a canonist to verify the marvel, only to find another house, a valley away, quietly burning the body of a benefactor that oozed the same crimson seep they called a curse. The contradiction gnawed. If holy blood on linen proved sanctity at Lanciano, what did sticky red on a dead man's chin prove here? The canonist, trained to separate grace from fraud, kept two ledgers. In the first, he recorded sworn testimonies of fragrance, incorruption, and edifying cures. In the second, locked in his saddlebag, he listed hours, temperatures, and the way the sun warmed the outer wall of the crypt. He advised the first abbey to frame the cloth in silver and process with dignity. He advised the second to rebury deep with lime and speak of nothing but fever. The Congregation of Rites tightened protocols. Any claim of bleeding relics now required multiple witnesses of proven probity and examination of the container seals. Simultaneously, the Holy Office circulated a private warning that the devil could mimic pious signs to trap the simple parish priests caught in the crossfire began to favor dryness. Better a miracle of scent than of flow. Better a statue that wept oil than a corpse that dripped blood. Still, the people loved drama. Word spread faster than decrees, and soon peddlers sold scraps of red-stained linen said to calm nightmares. The canonist returned to Rome, exhausted, his neat Latin frayed by experience. In his final memorandum, he wrote that the faithful crave touch and color that doctrine alone rarely satisfies in the dark. He recommended patient instruction and swift burial. Rome adopted the second and spoke vaguely of the first. In the end, the two houses kept their secrets. One displayed a reliquary that drew coins. The other mended its crypt wall and forgot aloud. Inside both, monks prayed the same psalms to a god who shed blood once and for all, while outside villagers wondered which stains to fear and which to kiss. Brother Matteo of the Dominican convent in Bologna spent years compiling a bestiary of spiritual adversaries, a compendium meant to aid preachers who lacked imagination when warning congregations about sin. Dragons symbolized pride, foxes, deceit, owls, ignorance. In a quiet folio near the end, he added a creature he called vampirus, though he cloaked the name in a Latin so twisted only the curious would unravel it. He described a body that refused corruption, a mouth stained as if from the chalice yet hostile to grace, and eyes that avoided dawn. His sources were not scripture, but letters from friars stationed in Hungary and Wallachia, men whose ink smelled of smoke and lime. Matteo wrestled with classification. Was this beast a demon in flesh, an animal enchanted, or a human caught between judgments? He finally placed it under pseudo-homins, false men, and added a note that preaching should focus on charity for the frightened and firmness against grave profaners. The manuscript circulated in copy among a handful of priories, always with marginal cautions that the chapter be omitted if the audience tended toward superstition. One zealous lector in Padua read the passage aloud anyway and found his students more interested in stakes than in saints. Rome heard a whisper of the text when a censor, reviewing Dominican materials for a new index, noticed the term and queried its source. The order replied that the entry was allegory, a metaphor for spiritual parasites who fed on parishioners. The censor accepted the gloss and moved on, but the manuscript was quietly shelved in an archive cabinet behind sermons on Arianism that no one opened. Years later, a novice rediscovered it and traced the fanged marginal doodles of a previous reader with his finger, half amused, half afraid. What Matteo intended as pastoral tool became a relic of anxiety, proof that even disciplined minds needed to name the thing in the dark before they could dismiss it. The bestiary never made the index of forbidden books. It simply slept, toothy and silent, until someone turned the page and felt watched. Fire was the church's purifier of last resort, but even flames bred doubt when villagers swore they heard screams long after the tongue should have stilled. In a hillside cemetery near Graz, a crowd gathered before dawn, while the parish priest read the De Profundis and the blacksmith piled brush around a disinterred corpse said to wander. The first crack of sap sent sparks into mist. Then a sound rose that witnesses later described as a howl, though physicians insisted it was trapped gas forcing air through the throat as tissues tightened. The smell was thick, sweet, and metallic. Women crossed themselves until their knuckles blanched. Men stared, daring the fire to prove them right. Rome detested such scenes, not only for their cruelty but for the theater that turned sacrilege into spectacle. A circular from the Holy Office in 1734 urged bishops to prevent public burnings of cadavers, calling them offenses against Christian burial, yet conceded that in times of pestilence, civil magistrates might order cremation for health. The parish priest in Graz solved the dilemma by withdrawing 10 paces and pretending not to see while murmuring prayers that could cover either act. Later, he wrote that the scream echoed only in those who wanted it. Others heard nothing but crackle. The pyre left a pit of ash that children dared each other to touch, and for weeks the cemetery reeked of smoke that rain could not wash. In sermon, the priest spoke of purgatorial flames, not brush fires. He warned against confusing senses with truths. Still, at night he dreamt of eyes opening in heat. A surgeon from Vienna who examined the remains afterward noted bone fragments charred but intact, suggesting the burn was hurried. He recommended deeper graves in lime, less theater. The report reached Rome, stripped of noise. It became a line item about sanitary measures, filed and forgotten. In the village memory, the night glowed forever, proof either that evil can scream or that fear can. Blood sat at the center of Catholic imagination long before peasants feared fangs. The chalice raised at Mass promised life through a crimson mystery, yet the same color on a corpse's lips suggested theft, not gift. Monks in refectories read Bernard of Clairvaux on the wound in Christ's side, on love poured out like wine, while in the same century village women whispered that drinking blood lengthened nights. The paradox gnawed hardest at confessors who had to preach that salvation came through a sip and damnation through a suck. In a Lombard priory, a lector tried to reconcile the images by teaching that holy blood moves outward to save while stolen blood moves inward to rot. A neat symmetry that satisfied students. until a letter arrived describing a revenant who recoiled from the chalice, yet lapped at a slaughtered pig. Theological symbolism shattered on such details. Canonists reminded everyone that sacramental signs are realities of grace, not analogies for folklore. Still, at midnight in sacristies, priests argued softly. One said that obsession with blood was a morbid twist of piety that had lost its anchor. Another feared that demon mocking always imitates divine patterns, turning Eucharist into appetite. Artists of the Baroque filled ceilings with torrents of red, angels catching drops in golden bowls, while under those frescoes embalmers wiped away the very stain that frightened widows. The faithful knelt between abundance and aversion, unsure when to kiss and when to burn. Rome issued no treatise on this double image. It did not need to. The liturgy spoke daily of blood redeemed. The countryside spoke nightly of blood consumed. Between them stood clergy with hands that trembled, lifting the chalice after wiping a corpse. They prayed that the people could taste the difference. They prayed that they themselves could. Ferrar's bishop did not trust fences or pious slogans to keep peace in the graveyard, so he ordered a night watch the way a captain posts sentries along a wall. Lanterns were trimmed at sunset, their glass panes smudged to dull the glare, and pairs of clerics and lay vergers walked the perimeter between the cypresses while the city slept. They carried staves tipped with iron and small tins of blessed salt that they shook at thresholds more from habit than from rubric. The first nights were quiet, save for owls and the drip of irrigation canals. Then a sexton swore he saw earth heave near the tomb of a moneylender buried without confession. The patrol dug with hands more than shovels and found only a fox burrow, but the story thickened in telling. Soon shopkeepers claimed to hear whispers from the cemetery wall, and mothers kept children indoors after dusk. The bishop drafted ordinances couched in sanitary language, forbidding loitering near graves and requiring deeper burials in lime. He knew law worked better than lore when fear spread. Yet, he also had the canons chant the office for the dead once a week on site, vestments flapping in the night breeze like flags over a contested fort. A physician from the ducal court argued that malaria and marsh mists caused the night terrors. He recommended draining ditches, not patrolling tombs. The bishop did both. For a month, the watch noted only cats and late lovers. Then a patrol found a fresh smear on a mausoleum door, dark and sticky. A butcher admitted later he spilled pig's blood while cutting across the yard. It took 3 sermons and a civic fine to erase the stain's legend. By Advent, the patrol disbanded quietly. The lanterns went back to sacristy shelves and the tins of salt to kitchen racks. Order returned, not because nothing ever rose, but because vigilance convinced the people it would not. Let that one sink in. When you are ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. Locks and seals became theology in stone. Architects hired to refurbish crypts in Pisa and Mantua found themselves sketching not just arches and drainage, but iron lattices, hidden behind marble mortise joints, packed with salt, wax impressed with episcopal rings, and then covered by frescoes, so no curious hand could break them without chipping a saint's robe. A canon from Mantua wrote that every barrier was also a prayer, though he admitted under breath that prayer alone no longer calmed parish councils who wanted proof their dead would stay down. Masons learned to leave chambers with only one vent, angled upward so gases escaped but nothing crawled out, and to cap niches with slabs doweled so tight a crowbar would shriek. The language on invoices stayed mundane. Extra clamps for moisture. additional sealant against damp. Everyone knew the damp they feared had teeth. In Verona, a young surveyor proposed a clever hinge system that allowed a coffin shelf to slide forward without opening the seal, in case of inspection. His drawings circulated quietly among chapter houses, tucked inside packets of chant corrections. Meanwhile, talismans slipped into joints where mortar met stone, tiny crosses of iron, dried sprigs of rue, even coins stamped with saints. Rome frowned on mixtures of folk charm and sacrament, but looked away when the result was order. One archivist placed a diagram of a new crypt door beside a decree against superstition, the contrast almost funny if fear had not paid the bill. Over years, these reinforcements changed the feel of sacred spaces. Crypt air grew stiller, thicker, safer, perhaps, or simply more trapped. Pilgrims above admired altarpieces while below walls bristled with unseen metal. The church told itself it was guarding relics. The laity told themselves the same, and neither said aloud that what they guarded against was not thieves. Consumption thinned Europe long before anyone called it tuberculosis, a wasting marked by night sweats, bright blood on handkerchiefs, and a slow hollowing that made the living look half-buried already. Physicians from Padua to Vienna argued that what villagers named vampirism was only phthisis, contagious and cruel, and they brought microscopes and Latin to parish halls thick with garlic smoke. In 1720, the Neapolitan doctor Bernardino Ramazzini lectured that superstition worsened plague by driving people to dig instead of cleanse, and a few decades later the Venetian anatomist Giovanni Battista Morgagni mapped lesions in lungs with the same precision peasants mapped bite marks. Yet when a doctor in Transylvania wrote to Rome that every case of so-called nightly visitations occurred in houses where a consumptive had died, bishops bristled. To reduce spiritual terror to sputum felt like an insult to both doctrine and dread. The physician urged quarantine, fresh air, and lime, not stakes. He cited Santorio's studies on perspiration, Boyle on air, Boerhaave on fevers, confident that science could quiet graves faster than psalms. Parish clergy read his pamphlet and nodded until sunset, then listened to widows swear they felt cold hands press on their chests. Rome allowed publication of medical tracts that mocked revenants as miasma, but cautioned printers to avoid ridiculing priests who cooperated with sanitary measures. In one Tuscan town, the doctor and the curate formed an uneasy pair. By day, they opened windows and burned bedding. By night, the curate blessed the threshold and let the doctor sprinkle lime like holy water. When the deaths slowed, each claimed victory. The doctor wrote an article for a learned journal. The curate preached thanksgiving. Neither mentioned the night the family insisted on opening father's coffin, and everyone stared at the rosy cheeks that decay can sometimes mimic. Science explained it. Fear did not listen. The term vampire lingered in kitchens long after P.H. Thesis entered textbooks. Even the doctor admitted privately that names matter. People obeyed a legend more readily than a lecture. So he learned to speak both, soothing with reason, conceding a prayer, and counting it success when the shovel stayed in the shed. In a convent outside Avignon, a young nun named Sister Claire began to speak of visions that left her trembling and ashamed. She said an angel told her to taste suffering as Christ did, and soon the infirmarian noticed punctures on her wrist and a pallor that deepened despite hearty broth. At first the prioress assumed the marks were from penance devices or garden thorns. Then another sister caught Claire in the cellar pressing her lips to the vein of a dying woman whispering apologies between swallows. Canon law had words for false mysticism and diabolical deceit, but none for a bride of Christ drinking blood in the dark. The confessor, a cautious oratorian, interrogated Claire gently. She insisted she felt a command, that the warmth calmed the roaring in her ears. He feared delusion more than monstrosity, and ordered seclusion, fasting, and the removal of all knives. Physicians summoned from town diagnosed hysteria and anemia, prescribing iron filings in wine. Meanwhile, rumors reached the bishop, who faced a double peril: scandal if word spread, spiritual ruin if he ignored it. He convened a discreet panel of theologians who debated whether Claire's act desecrated charity or parodied Eucharist. One argued for immediate expulsion and denunciation to the Holy Office. Another urged cloistered treatment to avoid feeding gossip. The prioress chose the latter. Claire was confined to an upper cell with a grill that opened only to receive broth thickened with animal blood under the fiction of fortifying her. Over months the craving ebbed or was hidden better. She died at 28, lungs scarred, lips cracked, rosary tangled in fingers that had once clenched too hard. The convent register recorded only obediens et pia, obedient and pious. Rome never saw the file. In the archive of the diocese, a marginal note beside her name reads cura singularis, singular care, a phrase that covers everything and admits nothing. The sisters kept her veil folded in a drawer as a warning and a relic, unsure which. They met in a side chamber off the apostolic palace, not in a formal consistory, but around a plain table scarred by ink and candle burns. Cardinals from the Holy Office, consultors from Propaganda Fide, a Jesuit mathematician called in for his cool head, and a Camaldolese abbot whose monks kept too many cemeteries. No agenda appeared on parchment. The summons said only de quiete fidelium, concerning the peace of the faithful. One by one they laid out fragments: frontier letters about stakings, autopsy notes with too much blood, parish registers that suddenly skipped causes of death. The Jesuit argued for a policy of silence backed by private science. The Camaldolese, eyes rimmed red from nocturnes, pleaded for a litany that people could pray when graves rustled, something official to drown the folk songs. A canonist reminded them that Rome could not legislate what it refused to name. A Dominican warned that indulgences had been granted for less, and that fear was a currency they were letting counterfeiters mint. The oldest cardinal, who remembered Galileo, cautioned that the more ink they spilled, the more weapons critics would find. They talked until the bell for vespers. Out of the tangle came a compromise thin as a wafer. Draft a private circular to bishops urging sanitary vigilance, deeper burials, cooperation with physicians, and pastoral emphasis on judgment and mercy after death. Add one sentence that clergy should discourage tales of the walking dead as contrary to faith. Leave out every vivid detail. File all frontier reports under epidemics. Commission a sermon model on Psalm 130 for use during outbreaks. Burn the drafts that said more. When they rose, no one felt triumphant. The abbot tucked his beads in his sleeve and whispered that monks fear silence more than wolves. The Jesuit promised to find better Latin for translation so priests could sound learned at graves. The circular went out with a seal and no signature. The council never officially existed, yet its caution shaped decades. Rome chose to rule the dead by pretending they slept. The reliquary in the Umbrian hill town had drawn pilgrims for a century. A glass coffin framed in gilt where the body of Saint Fiorenza lay in quiet dignity, fingers clasped, skin the color of parchment. One autumn afternoon, a visiting anatomist from Perugia peered closer than devotion required, and startled at the sight of canines that seemed longer than in the engravings sold in the piazza. Word leaked the way water finds mortar cracks. By week's end, vendors whispered that the saint had fangs. The rector convened his chapter and barred further close inspections, citing dust and the need to polish the crystal. He wrote Rome for advice and received the expected reply. Incorruption is judged by odor and flexibility, not dentistry. Still, he could not shake the image of teeth that looked ready to pierce. Old women recalled tales that Fiorenza tamed wolves with a glance. Young men joked that she tamed them by biting first. The local barber, who also pulled teeth, swore that post-mortem gum recession makes every mouth look hungry. He offered to demonstrate on skulls in his back room. The rector declined, and doubled candles at the shrine to throw soft light that hid edges. A Jesuit hagiographer tasked with revising Fiorenza's Vita deleted a line about her refusal of meat during Lent, fearing it would read differently now. He added instead a miracle of healing, a child with a blood disorder, turning the narrative away from mouths and toward mercy. Pilgrims kept coming, many kneeling further back, as if distance dulled doubt. A few pressed close eyes searching for a glint that would confirm late-night whispers. The saint did not move. In winter, the town dentist died, and his apprentice found notes in a drawer measuring teeth in corpses to prove a point no one had asked him to make. The paper yellowed. The shrine endured. Rome filed the matter as local zeal. In the sacristy, a young acolyte dared another to touch the glass. He did. It was cold. Nothing bit. Moralists of the Counter-Reformation had warned preachers to treat temptation as a drama of the will, not the flesh. Yet stories of revenants who lured victims with a look or a whisper forced theologians to borrow the language of seduction they once reserved for sirens and succubi. A Franciscan in Dalmatia wrote of a widow who said her dead husband leaned in at the window and spoke her pet name until she opened the latch. She swore she did not feel fear at first, but a strange warmth, as if confession could wait and longing could feed itself. Confessors scrambled to translate such intimacy into terms of sin they could absolve. Was the widow consenting to evil or trapped by illusion? Jesuit manuals began to include discreet queries about nocturnal visitors who looked like loved ones. They advised directing penitents to imagine the wounds of Christ whenever an old kiss called from the dark. Dominican ascetics preferred bluntness. They told hearers to spit at any vision that asked for blood. Meanwhile, artists hid lessons in paint. In a side chapel in Siena, a fresco shows a maiden turning from a pale figure toward the chalice, her eyes wet, his teeth just hinted where shadow meets lip. The caption speaks of grace, not of thirst, but anyone who had listened at a cottage door knew the code. The church feared not only bites, but the sweet talk that came before. To name it publicly risked planting ideas. To leave it unnamed risked more doors opening. So sermons wrapped seduction in parable, and confessors learned to hear pauses in sentences as well as words. In Rome, a consultor drafted a treatise on deceptive consolations, arguing that evil often mimics comfort, and that the faithful must test every sweetness against the cross. The Holy Office shelved it as too subtle. Parish life moved on, but the memory of voices at windows stayed in wood grain, and in the way old women crossed themselves twice before blowing out candles. A pause is good. But the secrets do not stop here. Subscribe and stay close. The gravedigger in a Tuscan parish kept a ledger as tidy as any merchant's, lines of ink noting name, age, depth of pit, soil condition, even the weather that day because rain made clay grip the spade. Around 1736, his entries changed. Beside 3 burials, he added nocte revisum, seen at night, then scratched it out so hard the page tore. He began to mark small crosses in the margin on weeks when families begged him to check a mound for settling, a sign they swore meant breathing below. The priest told him to stop encouraging panic. He answered that he preferred numbers to rumors. When the bishop conducted visitation, he skimmed the registers for sacraments and skipped the cemetery book, never seeing the pattern of reopened graves that arced like a constellation across 2 summers. The gravedigger recorded sounds as well. Scrape, sigh, fox. He wrote fox often, a code for anything he could not name without laughing or crying. One winter he noted that candles left by widows burned low, though there was no wind. Another spring he logged that the lime pit emptied faster than expected. His wife found the ledger once and asked why he wrote in Latin. He smiled and said the dead prefer it. After a particularly frantic week when villagers swore a child had been pressed by a cold weight, he drew a tiny bucket beside the entry for the child's burial, a reminder that he had poured extra lime. Years later, the new curate cleaning drawers found the book and brought it to the rectory table. He saw in those cramped notes the slow fever of a village and the quiet competence of the man who dug so others could sleep. He read the scratched words under candle glare and felt his stomach turn at what fear can carve in margins. He closed the ledger, blessed it as if it were a relic of endurance, and locked it away. Canon lawyers preferred tidy defendants with pulse and motive, yet the wave of grave openings forced them to choose a category for what villagers called vampires. They could not arraign a corpse, so they put the living on trial for superstition, sacrilege, or disturbance of burial. In Padua, a tribunal in 1,733 questioned men who had cut a heart from a cadaver and burned it in the square. The presiding auditors cited Gratian and later decretals that protected tombs, reminding them that Christian burial marked a body as sacred matter awaiting resurrection. The defendants insisted they acted to save their children from wasting. The court shifted strategy. If the belief in walking dead denied divine providence, it could be classed as heresy light, an error of the simple to be corrected with penance, not prison. Sentences tended toward fines, public prayers, and pilgrimages, a blend that soothed authority and spared shame. A few prosecutors tried to stretch the category of maleficium to include nocturnal feeding, arguing that those who spread the tale harmed souls. The Holy Office in Rome reviewed such decisions, and often softened them, wary of headlines and pamphlets that mocked inquisitors chasing ghosts. Behind the scenes, a memorandum circulated urging bishops to substitute medical inspectors for magistrates whenever possible. If a doctor declared natural causes, the canonist could declare the case closed without touching belief. This tactic worked until a village demanded a verdict on the dead themselves. Could the church declare a named corpse non-reveniens, not returning, and thus forbid further disturbance? One bishop drafted such a decree and stopped his pen before the name, fearing that to name a thing is to make it real. The compromise became silence wrapped in law. Trials recorded only the living. The dead remained pronouns and shadows. Over time, these files piled into a paper bulwark, proof that Rome managed panic by translating terror into venial paperwork. The parish of St. Vitus sat on a marsh edge where cattle often sickened and children woke coughing, So when every goat in a single byre was found drained and stiff, one July morning, the people said the swamp had learned to walk. The priest rode out with the steward of the local lord, a man more used to rents than blood, and together they followed a trail of prints that looked like bare feet pressed deep and then smeared by dew. In the farmhouse kitchen, a mother swore she heard something breathe at the door just before cockcrow. The priest sprinkled holy water along the lintel and told her to sleep with a candle lit. The steward ordered the herdsman to move his remaining animals to higher ground. That night more livestock died, this time sheep, and the whispers sharpened into a name, Petter, buried 3 weeks ago on the hill. Villagers gathered with shovels before dusk, but the priest stalled them with a promise. "Let me fetch the doctor from the market town," he said, "and if he finds only rot, I will say a mass, and you will leave the dead alone." The doctor came, sniffed at the carcasses, declared a wolf or a fever, and recommended fire to cleanse pens. The men looked past him toward the hill. At last, the priest allowed an inspection under canon law's cloak of public health. They opened Petter's grave. The face seemed ruddy, the abdomen swollen, a thin ooze at the lips. The doctor murmured about gases. The blacksmith gripped his mallet. The priest recited Psalm 130 so quickly the words blurred. In the end, they chose lime, not steak, shoveling it thick over the body while women keened a lullaby used for infants, as if the dead man needed soothing. For weeks after, the priest walked the marsh edge at night, listening for hooves, hearing only frogs. The parish register lists a note of unusual mortality among beasts that summer and a payment for quicklime. No word of Petar, but in the margin beside the expense the priest drew a tiny hoof in a smaller droplet, then crossed both out until the parchment thinned. Clergy were taught to master passions by fasting and vigils, yet fear is a creature that slips past discipline. In rectories from Dalmatia to the Danube, men of the cloth scratched prayers into desk wood and traced crosses on window frames, not out of rite but reflex. A curate in Slavonia confessed to his diary that he slept with a lantern lit and a walking stick near the bed, ashamed to name it a stake. Another in Umbria carved little notches in the pew he used for matins, counting how many times a floorboard creaked behind him. Spiritual directors urged them to meditate on death serenely, to keep a skull on the shelf as memento mori, but those bones never knocked. The knock came from a coffin in memory or from the parish door, after midnight, when a widow gasped that she heard breathing at her sill. Priests learned to breathe in fours, the way singers do, to steady hands before lifting a chalice after an exhumation, to wash vestments twice when a drop of something more than wine-stained lace. Some turned to psychology before the word existed, telling themselves that marsh, gas, foxes, and grief made shapes in the dark. Others whispered to each other that temptation takes any mask, even one sewn from dead skin. In one Jesuit house near Graz, the rector instituted a weekly recreation hour where men told ghost stories aloud so fear could be laughed at, then ended the custom when a scholastic fainted. Rome saw none of this. Reports that climbed the ladder spoke of zeal and pastoral care. The margins held the sweat. A bishop, visiting a country deanery, found the breviary of a dead priest with Psalm 91 dog-eared and grease-stained, the verse about terror by night underlined twice. He closed it and said nothing, sensing that courage in a cassock sometimes sounded like a muttered psalm over a shaking cup. Sunlight was supposed to be the oldest cure in the book of folklore, the dawn that scatters bats and banishes specters, yet one case in Apulia unsettled even that comfort. Brother Matteo, a lay friar, charged with tending the orchard, collapsed at first light one June morning, his robe smoking at the hem as if he had brushed against an ember. Fellows rushed him indoors and doused the cloth. His skin blistered where it should have merely reddened. Later in the infirmary, he insisted he had only been praying by the garden cross when a warmth like a furnace wrapped him. A visiting physician blamed sunstroke, pointing to the haze that rose off the stones. The prior agreed publicly and whispered privately that Matteo had been the one who kept watch in the crypt last winter. Soon the friars argued in low voices about whether the old rule held that creatures of night perish in day. A rationalist canon from Bari wrote a pamphlet explaining how certain fevers make skin photosensitive, then scoffed at tales of smoldering monks. Still, the story traveled faster than his pages. Villagers began to claim that the undead had learned to walk at dawn to trick them. The friars responded by adjusting their vigils, ending before sunrise so no one lingered outside alone. Rome received a query about adding a line to the Litany of the Saints for protection at morning light, as well as midnight. The Congregation of Rites declined, noting that God already governs hours. The incident became catechetical fodder. Preachers used it to warn against trusting in folklore rather than providence. In the orchard, the scorch marks faded. Brother Matteo healed slowly and took to wearing a broad hat, which made the novices joke he feared sun like a vampire. He laughed louder than needed and kept to the shade. The community never decided if heat or horror made the cloth smoke. They only learned that even doctrines about dawn can flicker when a robe catches fire. Pamphlets move like sparks. To counter the blaze of rumor, Jesuit presses in Vienna and Prague issued sheets that blended science and scripture, ridiculing revenants as products of poor burial and rich imagination. Father Karl Reckberger penned one such tract in 1733, citing Boyle on putrefaction, Borelli on motion, and Aquinas on demons' limits, wrapping it all in polite satire that compared vampire hunters to children chasing shadows on a wall. The text did its duty in salons and among magistrates, but in taverns it had the opposite effect. Readers seized on the lurid descriptions, meant as refutations, and repeated them without the punchline. A Protestant printer in Saxony pirated the tract and added woodcuts of fanged corpses to mock Catholic gullibility, pushing the image farther. Rome saw the irony. A memorandum from the Holy Office warned that too vivid a denial becomes advertisement. The Jesuits adjusted tone, shifting from mockery to gentle correction, framing walking dead as metaphors for exploitation and spiritual leeches. Parish clergy borrowed the language and preached against landlords who drained peasants as if they were the vampires all along. The metaphor worked in cities, stumbled in villages where goats still bled. Meanwhile, Dominican preachers in Poland refused satire entirely, delivering stern sermons on the finality of death. Their severity drove some to hush rather than trust. The contest of pamphlets became a shadow war. For every learned tract, a broadsheet in Krakow or Bratislava ran a ballad about a girl kissed by her dead lover. In Rome, a censor began to cut entire paragraphs from manuscripts that mentioned fangs, claiming space needed for indulgence schedules. Jesuit colleges taught rhetoric students how to diffuse panic with humor. Yet their graduates discovered in the field that laughter sounds hollow when a coffin lid rattles. In the end, the society learned to cede its lessons quietly, folding natural philosophy into catechism classes and giving doctors a pulpit without a cassock. The sheets yellowed, the rumors did not. Ecumenism was not a word in the 18th century lexicon, Yet the politics of corpses forced a strange diplomacy between Rome and Orthodox bishops in the Balkans, where exhumation rites differed sharply. In Serbian villages, priests robed in black would dig up bodies 3 years after burial to wash bones, a custom Rome viewed with suspicion but tolerated for peace. When accusations of vampirism erupted, both sides claimed jurisdiction over graves. A papal envoy to Belgrade found himself negotiating not theology of transubstantiation, but who could swing a shovel. He discovered that Orthodox clergy already had prayers for restless dead known as Molitva za nemirne, while Catholic rubrics avoided the topic. The envoy proposed a practical treaty. Catholics could attend the washing as witnesses to ensure no mutilation. Orthodox could observe Catholic reburials to assure no sorcery. Each side signed in silence, knowing empires watched. At the same time, Habsburg officials demanded uniform sanitary codes regardless of rite. Rome quietly instructed missionaries to cooperate with local hierarchs and to frame any intervention as concern for scandal, not doctrine. A letter from Propaganda Fide addressed to an Orthodox metropolitan even suggested shared processions to calm towns. The metropolitan replied that Rome should first tame its own pamphleteers. Behind formal exchanges lay barbs. Orthodox monks accused Catholics of hiding vampire fears behind Latin. Catholic friars accused Orthodox of stirring them with bone-washing. Yet, in a graveyard at twilight, the two often stood together, chanting in tongues neither fully understood, united by the need to keep villagers from tearing corpses apart. The episode taught Rome that sometimes unity flows upward from dirt rather than downward from decrees. It also left a paper trail of uneasy cooperation, filed under mixed marriages because there was no folder for mixed graves. The politics of the dead did what centuries of councils could not for one night: make two churches move in harmony so children could sleep. Rest your mind, you've earned it, but when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Painters learned early how to hide messages for those who knew where to look. In a Baroque chapel near Arezzo, a fresco of St. Michael trampling the dragon includes, in a corner shadow, a pale face with lips parted and 2 teeth just perceptible if the candle angle is low. The patron never noticed. The artist signed with a flourish and a smirk. Art historians centuries later debated whether these hints were playful sin or coded commentary on the fears that sermons could not voice. The Council of Trent had laid strict rules on sacred images, demanding clarity and doctrinal correctness, but it said nothing about teeth in the gloom. A Roman censor evaluated sketches before paint touched plaster, yet no censor could police every glaze or shadow once scaffolds came down. In Venice, an altar painting of the Last Supper shows Judas reaching for bread with a hand that casts a shadow shaped like a jaw with fangs, a trick of perspective only visible from the north aisle. The Dominican who commissioned it shrugged when told, claiming demons deserve bad press. In Siena, a series on the virtues depicts temperance holding a chalice while a tiny bat clings to the rim. No one complained. Perhaps no one saw. In the Vatican itself, some whispered that a tapestry in the Galleria del Carte Geographique included a bat wing in a corner of the map of Hungary, sewn by a mischievous Flemish weaver after a night of wine with German guards. Rome ignored gossip unless it sold prints. The faithful did not need more shadows. Yet these details reveal an undercurrent. Artists absorbed the same rumors as bakers and barbers. They painted what they heard, camouflaged in gold and ultramarine. For those whose eyes scanned for comfort, angels glowed. For those whose eyes darted to corners after matins, teeth waited in pigment. Theology rarely mentions painters as chroniclers of panic. Their walls remember anyway. Relics that bled or liquefied drew crowds and coin, but reliquaries that contained actual blood, set in crystal ampoules, became suspect once collectors with occult tastes began to trade them. In Naples, a nobleman was caught purchasing a vial said to hold the dried blood of a martyr and using it in private rites to ward off night terrors. The archbishop seized the piece and preached against trafficking in sanctity. Meanwhile, in Rome, the treasury of a minor basilica discovered 3 ampoules missing after a summer of scaffolding. A mason confessed to selling them to a bookseller who shipped curiosities north. The Holy Office issued a stern notice that sacred fluids belonged under lock and triple key, and any ampule found outside an altar was to be returned or destroyed. Black markets adapt faster than decrees. Soon, vendors claimed their wares were only animal blood, blessed by a hermit. Scholars warned that fetishizing blood, even holy blood, fed the same appetite that made peasants fear vampires. One canonist argued that emphasis should shift to bones and fabrics, not fluids. Another fretted that denying blood undercut Eucharistic catechesis. The compromise again was silence and better locks. In one Umbrian town, the sacristan began to weigh ampoules weekly and record weights, a practice learned from apothecaries. He noticed slight changes and panicked until a chemist explained evaporation. Still, he sealed the stoppers with wax, embossed with the bishop's ring, and stored them in a box lined with iron. Rumors persisted that certain collectors in Prague and Paris held cabinets of blood from saints and sinners alike, and that they mixed drops to conjure protection. Rome condemned all such experiments as superstition when it could prove them. Most it could not. In inventories of church treasures from that era, notations beside ampoules grow brief. The less said, the safer. Yet in candlelight believers still leaned close to see if the red stirred, hoping for proof of life, fearing proof of hunger. One spring, the crypt of San Lorenzo in Lucina filled ankle-deep with red water after a pipe burst behind a wall that had hidden a Roman noble's tomb for 2 centuries. Parishioners who smelled rust more than rot cried miracle and curse in the same breath. The pastor waded through, shoes ruined, cursing the city's plumbing rather than demons. But he could not deny that the liquid looked like diluted blood in that stone light. He sent for engineers and for a theologian, hedging bets. The engineers broke through to find a corroded lead conduit and clay soil rich in iron that stained the flood. The theologian tasted a drop and declared ferric, not sacred. Words still beat them to the piazza. By evening, people gathered to see the red trickle at the doorway, mothers dipping handkerchiefs, men crossing themselves with nervous flourish. The vicar of Rome issued an announcement that any fluid in the crypt was sewage and contact should be avoided. That dampened enthusiasm, but not story. Someone said, a noble once accused of sorcery was buried there, and now bled for his sins. A pamphleteer embellished. The pastor decided to drain at night and posted Swiss guards to keep crowds away while masons worked. In his report, he listed expenses: pumps, lime, plaster, no line for panic. Rome filed it under maintenance. Yet the event prompted a renewal of inspections of ancient crypts for structural integrity, ostensibly to prevent accidents, actually to check for other stains that could breed tales. In catechism that Sunday, the pastor preached on the blood of Christ versus the blood of earth, drawing a line villagers could carry home. A week later, the floor dried. The stone kept a faint blush only trained eyes noticed. Years later, a child who had dipped her cloth told her granddaughter that the church once bled. The granddaughter laughed and then visited to see. The crypt smelled of dust. Memory had colored what iron once did. By the late 18th century, microscopes peered at capillaries while confessionals still listened for sighs. Enlightenment physicians like Giovanni Battista Morgagni and later Xavier Bichat cut bodies open to map disease, and their findings filtered slowly into seminaries where professors slipped new terms beside Old Latin. A Jesuit in Parma taught natural philosophy to future priests, explaining fermentation in corpses and the chemistry of decay, then walked them through pastoral scenarios where such knowledge might calm a crowd at a grave. Some students thrilled at the clarity. Others worried that too much science would thin mystery. The Roman Curia watched cautiously. It allowed medical lectures in colleges, but warned against letting doctors dictate liturgy. In 1797, a small team of clerics and surgeons examined a series of suspected vampire graves in Friuli, gathering data on soil composition, coffin depth, and ambient temperature. Their report concluded that no preternatural cause appeared and recommended standardized burial practices. Tucked in the appendix was a note that fear subsides when people see officials handle bodies with confidence. The congregation of the council circulated the recommendations quietly. At the same time, pamphlets about galvanism and reanimation startled readers who saw in experiments with frogs' legs echoes of the very revenants Rome had denied. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin would soon write Frankenstein, but Italian villages already whispered that lightning could wake the dead. The church responded with sermons on the difference between animation and soul, on God's unique breath. Priests began to keep on hand a few phrases about nerves and gases to season their homilies when panic flared. Science entered the sacristy not as conqueror but as tool. One bishop joked that lime was his new holy water. Another scolded him for irreverence. Both used it. The line between anatomy theater and crypt narrowed. In records, the terminology shifted. Vampires became anomalies. Stake became sanitary measure. Rome adapted not by capitulating to reason alone, but by learning to wield it with the same quiet authority it used for incense. A Curial letter dated 1869, tucked between correspondence on diocesan finances, declares with bureaucratic firmness that the so-called vampire is a myth born of ignorance, and that pastors should quell such talk as they would any idle superstition. The timing is telling. Spiritualism was sweeping salons, table rapping in Rome itself, while medical journals still debated premature burial. The letter scolded priests who permitted exhumations without civil order. Yet in a handwritten addendum, the author advised bishops to maintain vigilance over cemeteries during epidemics. Double-speak hardened into habit. Publicly, the church mocked fangs. Privately, it watched graves. The author, Monsignor Pietro Bianchi, had served in Dalmatia as a young priest and never forgot a night of digging. He wrote the denial with one hand and the warning with the other, sealing them in the same envelope. Newspapers that year ran serialized Gothic tales. Pamphleteers dredged old Habsburg reports for sensation. Rome feared ridicule more than revenants now. It also feared losing authority to mediums who offered voices of the dead without sacraments. Thus the insistence that the dead rest and only saints speak. The letter's final line urged devotion to the Sacred Heart as antidote to morbid fascinations, turning blood talk toward grace again. Parish priests received the circular and shrugged. Most had not heard vampire tales in years. In the Balkans, the word still lurked, but nationalism now colored it more than theology. The Vatican had won by outlasting, yet it kept the files. A clerk penciled a cross-reference from Bianchi's letter to 18th century dossiers marked epidemic. He knew curiosity would never fully die. When photography reached undertakers and families saw eyes open in plates because of exposure times, new rumors stirred. The letter was quoted again. Myth, it said. Still, cemeteries got taller walls. Switches were wired, so bells at graves could ring if someone inside woke. The church blessed the ropes and called them prudence, myth in print, vigilance in stone. Newsreels flickered in the Vatican Film Library long before most Catholics knew the Holy See collected celluloid. Among reels of papal audiences and missionary work sits a canister labeled only Balkans 1935. Archivists who previewed it in the 1960s described grainy footage of villagers in black clustered around an open grave, while a man in a white coat gestured with a scalpel. A priest crossed himself, then turned his back as a stake was lifted. The film never screened publicly. Pius XI had created the library to document the modern church, not to archive folklore. Yet someone sent the reel, perhaps a Catholic doctor proud of bringing science to panic, perhaps a propagandist. A memo attached warns that showing it would scandalize or amuse enemies. The reel stayed sealed. After the war, when horror cinema boomed, Curial officials revisited the question. Could they produce a documentary debunking superstitions? They decided silence still served best. Decades later, a researcher requested access and was told the film was too damaged to project. Rumor says the emulsion stuck and tore, leaving only fragments of flicker and faces. The existence of the reel proves something Rome rarely admits. Officials watched, even in the age of microphones and motorcars. The old fears still walked. Pastors in Transylvania now dealt with communist atheism more than vampires. Yet a priest interviewed secretly in 1952 mentioned in passing that he still blessed lime before burials to calm grandmothers. The camera captured one era's solution. The vault kept it so future eyes could learn. The library catalog lists the canister today with a call number and a note. Consult requires permission of the prefect. Few ask, fewer receive. Somewhere on brittle film, a stake falls and a priest looks away. Modern theologians, writing after Vatican II, sought metaphors that spoke to urban souls. Vampires became a convenient image for exploitation, addiction, and systems that drain life. A Jesuit ethicist in 1973 published an essay titled Parasites of the Spirit, arguing that the true undead are ideologies that consume communities while claiming salvation. The piece passed peer review and raised no curial eyebrows because its monsters were economic, not nocturnal. Parish renewal programs use the language too, warning against relationships that suck faith dry. In doing so, the Church domesticated the vampire, turning it from folklore into symbol. Yet, in rural parishes of Eastern Europe, older priests rolled their eyes at metaphors and kept sprinkling graves in spring. A liturgical scholar proposed adding a petition to the prayer of the faithful for those tormented by fears of the dead, then revised it to victims of superstition to suit editors. Rome's International Theological Commission discussed death rituals and avoided the word entirely. Pastors were encouraged to emphasize resurrection hope, to brighten funerals, to ban black vestments. Some laity grumbled that white on coffins felt like denial. Meanwhile, pop culture poured vampires into living rooms. Clergy reported teenagers asking if staking was ever a sin. Catechists responded with lessons on dignity of the body. An American bishop once quipped on radio that garlic belongs in sauce, not sacristy, then received letters from Italian grandmothers who did both. The Vatican Media Office issued guidelines for engaging with paranormal fads, suggesting caution, respect for grief, and refusal to sensationalize. Behind the scenes, a small working group in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith reviewed pastoral letters from countries where vampire lore persisted and drafted a template reply: stress Christ's victory, allow prudent sanitary measures, forbid mutilation, discourage folklore. The template echoed 18th century memoranda in tone if not typeface. The monster changed costume. The Church's instinct remained: control the narrative, comfort the frightened, and never let teeth write doctrine. Forensic teams in the early 21st century reopened old graves in Venice, Lazaretto Nuovo among them, searching for plague data. In 2006, an archaeologist uncovered a skeleton with a brick jammed in its mouth, a Renaissance plague precaution against supposed vampires. The image flashed across journals and websites, and suddenly medieval dread wore a digital halo. Italian newspapers dubbed it the Vampire of Venice. Scholars explained that grave diggers used bricks to stop purge fluids from leaking and to symbolically stop chewing noises caused by gas. The Church watched the headlines with weary interest. A diocesan spokesman told reporters that the find showed how fear distorts faith and praised modern science for clarity. Quietly, diocesan archives checked whether any 17th century decrees mentioned such practices. They found none. DNA analysis of the skeleton suggested a middle-aged woman. Pathology hinted at malnutrition. No fangs, only worn molars. The story still sold. Documentaries mixed interviews with shots of candlelit crypts. A priest from the Patriarchate of Venice participated, stressing compassion for ancestors who fought plague with what knowledge they had. Online forums buzzed. Teenagers shared photos of the skull with bricks and asked if the Church ever did that. Catechists sighed and wrote blog posts. The study of the dead grew sophisticated, yet every new datum fed the same old appetite. Rome's Pontifical Academy for Life hosted a conference on death rituals and body dignity that referenced the Venice skull in a footnote about historical misunderstandings. No one said vampire aloud. In a parish near the lagoon, an old woman told her granddaughter that once people feared corpses chewed through shrouds, so they stopped the mouths. The girl asked if she should fear. The grandmother said only fear becoming cruel. Science closed one door, curiosity opened another. The brick stayed in the museum case, mute, half explanation, half mirror. Step back from coffins and catacombs, and the figure that looms is not a pale villager, but the Church itself, worrying about parasites within its own walls. When reformers accused clergy of feeding on the flock, of living off blood and sweat, the metaphor cut like a stake. Sermons about spiritual vampirism multiplied in the 19th century, aimed at bankers, politicians, even certain orders. The fear that drove Rome's caution about undead tales may have been partly about optics. A leak of power is deadly to an institution that survives on trust. Thus, the obsession with sealing graves and sealing stories, with controlling narrative as tightly as a crypt door. In the archives, one can trace anxiety about corruption in the same file series as anxiety about revenants. Both are framed as threats that drain life. Both are answered with discipline, secrecy, and carefully worded denials. The vampire becomes a mirror the Vatican avoids because its reflection flickers uncomfortably. A pope once wrote privately that shepherds must never seem to feed on sheep. He meant money, not blood, but the image is the same. When scandals broke in the 20th century, journalists reached for vampire language again. The church bristled. Yet to understand why Rome feared tales of walking dead more than devils is to see that devils live in doctrine, managed by exorcists, while vampires lived in rumor, managed by people, and people are wild. Control of imagination is harder than control of liturgy. So Rome drew curtains, bricked walls, edited margins, and hoped that by never saying the word, it could starve it. It did not. It only taught it to whisper. The fear of being seen as a devourer haunts every decree about charity and transparency today. Blood, literal or figurative, remains the currency of trust. Lose it, and you look undead even while breathing. So we arrive where candlelight thins and the ink dries, at a question that never really wanted an answer. Did vampires stalk the Vatican's imagination more fiercely than Satan because they looked like us, and would not stay where sacraments put them? The files we have read and the silences we have felt say this: Rome feared not fangs, but the collapse of boundaries. Death is supposed to be tidy in theology. It was messy in cellars and fields. The church responded the way any vast organism does when threatened, by tightening membranes, labeling invasions as error, and quietly adapting tactics while refusing to adjust doctrine. Stakes became lime. Exorcisms became sanitary inspections. Papal bulls became private letters. People kept digging, priests kept praying, doctors kept measuring, and somewhere between them, the undead turned into a metaphor that still bites because it is about hunger and helplessness. Whether a corpse ever climbed from a crypt matters less than why bishops leaned on locks and words. They were guarding more than bones. They were guarding the promise that graves are gates, not revolving doors. Tonight we have wandered through that promise, seen where it frayed, and watched hands stitch it in midnight halls. If you felt the shiver, let it remind you that history is a living thing, warm in some places, cold in others, and always capable of opening its eyes when we thought it asleep. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.